Welcome to this podcast, Your Places or Mine, with me, John Goodall, the architecture editor of Country Life magazine.
And me, Clive Aslett. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Cambridge and publisher of Tricliffe Books.
And this week we're going to be talking about another figure who figures really prominently in Lutyens' life, namely his wife.
Yes.
Lady Emily Lytton.
Yes, we've talked about Gertrude Jekyll and we've talked about Edward Hudson, who was the founder of Country Life and his great friend. And really, Lady Emily is, of course, as his wife, a very important figure in his early life.
But pivotal in all sorts of unexpected ways, and herself a really remarkable individual. Often actually at odds with Lutyens, but they remain an affectionate couple at their death, don't they?
Well, they remain a couple. Yes, they are affectionate, I think, at Lutyens' death. I think it was a sort of thunder and lightning kind of marriage. It was very difficult for Lutyens, but that can partly be explained by the fact that they were such terribly different people.
And I think it was very difficult for Lady Emily too, in different ways.
Well, it was, and I think that Lady Emily emerges as being a very remarkable figure in her own right, who I think nowadays people would want to examine even as closely as Lutyens, really. In some ways, that would have been less the case. For example, Edward Hudson thought she was a very bad thing because she was distracting from her husband's work. But I think we would view it differently now.
It's Edward Hudson as in the founding editor of
Yes, who was such a supporter. But he was a great believer, rightly, in Lutyens' genius. And so we thought anything that got in the way
was a problem.
And really, frankly, Lady Emily's role as Lutyens' wife was to make sure it all worked for him. And she wasn't so terribly good at doing that.
Yes, no. Tell us a little bit about her, because she is, such a contrasting figure in her background to Lutyens, who is relatively modestly born. I mean, with his painter father, who's not a very good animal painter, in these rather reduced circumstances.
Well, I would say genteel, but not thriving.
But Lady Emily is from a different world.
Yes, completely different kettle of fish, but rather complex, really, both in herself and in her background, or the background, I should say, really sort of explains quite a lot about her. They met, Lutyens and Lady Emily, in the mid-1890s. She was 5 years younger than him, and in her early 20s. And he saw her, proverbially, across a crowded room, and saw her she had a very long nose, she tended to look rather sort of gloomy, and saw this person looking very unhappy. And Lutyens was this sort of fizzing, impish, very witty young man, although shy himself. They were both very shy. And he went bouncing over to her and said, "You look terribly unhappy. I'm going to devote the rest of my life to cheering you up," or words to that effect.
Very dangerous thing to say.
and then pursued her with much romantic
Determination,
and she fell in love with him. They both wanted to get married very much, and there were obstacles.
But before we describe that, I mean, you need to know, don't you, about, or the listener needs to know, that she is from an aristocratic family.
Yes,
hugely sophisticated.
Yes, cosmopolitan.
But, I mean, describe, her father's been Viceroy of India.
Well, yes, it goes back. I mean, his father was a literary gent called Bulwer Lytton.
Yes, he was a celebrated Victorian novelist at the time, isn't he?
I think unreadable.
Now.
I think absolutely unreadable now. And I think he became Baron Lytton. He didn't become Baron Lytton. But he wasn't particularly, they were aristocratic, but they weren't terribly rich by the standards of their class.
Yes, they weren't great landowners. Yeah.
But they were also sort of had this literary thing of Bulwer Lytton was described in his Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry as being effeminately handsome and languidly aristocratic. So you get the message, and he was a rather aloof figure and alienated a lot of people. He, again, was very shy, and so the sort of aloofness was perhaps a reflection of that. But he
has this terrible relationship, with his wife. He married an Irish beauty who's herself very remarkable. They fall out spectacularly over his many liaisons with other women. And then she takes to publishing writing novels about how she's been mistreated. And they have this tragic daughter.
But he tries to get her put in an insane asylum because
exactly,
which is what Dickens did actually with his wife.
And then his daughter, who has some medical condition, is left to die alone in a boarding house in London.
Oh dear, I didn't know that.
Yes, and he permits his wife to see her one last time, but he doesn't go and see her himself. I mean, he sounds, in many of figures of this kind, he comes across a very ambiguous figure. But then, sort of really interesting as background to his great-granddaughter.
Yes. Because his son, Lady Emily's father, who became the first Earl Lytton, he inherited some of these characteristics. I mean, he was a successful politician, or a successful diplomat, really, I suppose, and he became Viceroy of India, as you rightly said. But he regarded his diplomatic successes as being nothing to his writing. That's what he really wanted to do. He was very successful when he was minister in Paris, because he was mixing in this sort of arty, literary world, and he was very good at going around being a great conversationalist and things. I don't think he's regarded as being a great hit as Viceroy of India.
Yeah, that's right.
He went out in 1876. The next year, Queen Victoria was declared Queen Empress. Yeah. But the year after that, he initiated what's called an imbroglio, which was the Second Afghan War. And
not a success.
It was not a success. No, it went very, very well to begin with. And the major who was leading it cabled, saying, all is well. And the next day, he and his entire mission were slaughtered inside the residency. And it was all a complete disaster. There was then an invasion, and that didn't go very well. So anyway, he didn't really cover himself in glory with that. But he took opium. So he wasn't a characteristic, if you like,
Viceroy, what you might imagine.
Or Victorian aristocrat, I was going to say.
And his daughter, Lady Emily, she is born in India, is she?
No, she was born in Paris when he was minister there. And she grew up in this, sort of slightly rackety circle for an aristocrat. But the defining moment of her early years as a young woman was that she had a relationship. She was pursued by one of her father's friends, called Wilfred Scowen Blunt, who was a sort of literary figure and a terrible sort of predator, sexual predator, we would call him nowadays. In the old days, just a cad. But this awful man pursued to tremendous lengths Lady Emily and wouldn't take no for an answer. I think exactly what the upshot was is uncertain. And I mean, anyway, we just don't know quite how it progressed as a flirtation or an affair. But that is what had happened. She was sort of on the rebound when she met Lutyens. I mean, Lutyens was somebody who was completely inexperienced in these matters. He was rather puppyish. Very little experience with girls at all, although he grew up with a number in his own family.
And it's effectively a whirlwind romance. And
yes.
Very rapid. But the parents deeply disapproved, don't they?
He was dead. Lord Lytton was dead by then.
But her mother.
Deeply disapproved, and you can see why, because being an architect, I mean, while the Lyttons weren't very rich by the standards of their class, they were nevertheless earls.
Very rich, in absolute terms.
In absolute terms, in comparison to anybody else. Whereas here was this young man who came from a family which was arty, which was an embarrassment.
And you said, genteel but not rich, not...
No, and frankly slightly bonkers in the case of the father. So, that was very difficult. And also, if you think about it, an architect on the rise, and Lutyens was going to get one of the biggest practices there's ever been in this country. But actually, at the time, that was very far from certain. And an architect, well, if you think of the Forsyte saga, there's an architect in that who completely fails.
It's a risky bet, is it?
High risk, and very middle class, so not socially distinguished, but also very, very risky.
And crucially, Lady Lytton, imposes these terms, doesn't she?
Yes.
That Lutyens has to ensure his income.
Yes, exactly. And because if he had died, they were very anxious to make sure, and I think this was a fairly standard provision, but it was very onerous for Lutyens to ensure that Lady Emily would continue to live as she had been brought up, i.e. in an aristocratic house. And indeed, although she outlived Lutyens, she always required a lot of servants in the house. I mean, it was exceptional for an architect. And that also was very difficult for him.
So Lutyens basically has this slight, it's not exactly an albatross, but it drives him to work, doesn't he? He has to pay this insurance.
Yes, he might have done that. He might have done it anyway, because that's really what he wanted to do. He really lived for architecture. But certainly it was a spur, because he had to do it. He had to find this money every month to pay this bond and to keep up the expenses of the family, which were considerable.
So they have a whirlwind romance, and when they get married, I mean, they're married within a very short period, aren't they, of first meeting? Is that right?
Well, relatively, I mean, there was this big hold-up because
the family objected.
So, but it wasn't a delay of a very long time by Victorian standards. It was only, I think, about 6 months or a year, something like that. But anyway, they got over it and they got married. And I mean, Lutyens was very, very romantic, and he created this casket.
That's what I was going to say.
And it's full of all things which were symbolic of the wonderful home life they're going to have together, including a little plan of a white house, and
which was going to be their married home.
Which was going to be their married home in the country, and it had things like
it had a pipe. It had a
pipe stopper because he always smoked. He always had a pipe in his mouth, and so it was an image of him sitting at the domestic hearth, and there were things like anchors for hope, and these
a miniature Bible. And there's a letter, isn't there? Am I misremembering that? That's in the casket as well to her, or maybe that's part of the plan. I can't quite remember, but it's an extraordinary thing.
It's about a dozen objects which have this great symbolic and romantic value, and in a beautiful, beautiful casket, like a sort of medieval reliquary almost.
It's a lover's gift.
So it's deeply, deeply romantic, and that's what. And I mean, possibly that was what was being expressed from Lutyens' side, and Lady Emily perhaps also was romantic in receiving it, but it was very, very soon apparent that they really were completely different personalities. From the very honeymoon, they went to Scheveningen in Holland, which has got this wonderful sandy beach, and they sat on it in deck chairs, facing different ways, because Lutyens couldn't bear being by the sea. It was totally boring for him. And so he had his deck chair looking at the land, and she had her deck chair looking at the sea.
It's not a promising...
No, you could see what was going to happen.
Beginning. But they do then have several children. They have...
Yes, they do. According to Mary, who is one of them, who became a writer, and wrote a book which kind of rather lifted the veil on her parents' secrets in a rather controversial way at the time. She didn't much care for sex, at least not from him.
Yeah.
I mean, he was possibly not... I mean, it was a very typical Victorian situation, I should think, that he was probably terribly inexperienced and insensitive, and she was not particularly... She didn't like that. She didn't like childbirth. She actually didn't like anything about domesticity whatsoever. And so to be married to this man who was the greatest builder of houses of his generation, this idea of the White House, which was going to be their home.
This was totally...
they never got there. They never got there. I mean, everything in the kitchen. Of course, she didn't actually cook it herself, naturally, but still, choosing a cook was a domestic skill. And everything came out burnt. And Lutyens could never have the sort of dinner parties he would have wanted.
Because she was not interested. I mean, it is common.
She just couldn't do it. She was hopeless.
It is a marriage. I mean, I don't know, you tell me, but it feels as though it's a marriage of phases. That there's initially a very, relatively warm period, even though they're not perhaps very well matched to each other when they have their children, and then there's a bit in the middle where really it is quite a cold relationship.
I think part of the appeal to Lady Emily was that she could see. She must have recognised Lutyens' exceptional gifts in architecture, and she saw the marriage as being one in which she helped her husband. Well, that wasn't really Lutyens' conception at all, and he once remarked when he was asked, this is rather a terrible thing by modern standards, "Sir Edwin, what do you see as the role of women in architecture? To be architects' wives?"
He said, yeah.
He said. So you can see that this didn't work. And so, and it's easy to see it from Lady Emily's point of view. I mean, in the Victorian and Edwardian period, of course, a lot of people did work at, marriages. Men had to go off to make their way, and it took them away from the domestic hearth.
Which was, yes, the woman's responsibility.
But nevertheless... You can see that, yes, and the woman had the responsibility of the children and everything, but Lady Emily didn't care for that very much. Yes, indeed. But Lutyens was pursuing this work all the time, which partly he felt he had to do because how else could he realise this genius that he had, but also to make the money that he needed to run the family and pay this heavy insurance bond. He was always away. He was always away on site visits or looking at new potential places to build or schmoozing clients.
And also, I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, that they write to each other, even despite all the thicks and the thins of their relationship. They are very regular correspondents, aren't they? I mean, he writes to her.
Endlessly. It's like a phone call today, all the time.
But we don't have her letters to him, do we?
Not. We have some, but she didn't write. He was a brilliant letter writer, and he wrote very, very spontaneously, often from sort of railway carriages and things. I mean, it's very difficult to read his writing, but they're very funny and very perceptive about people. He was very good at sketching characters, or indeed doing little doodles, which also were very fun and revealing. She was slightly more staid in the way she wrote, but they did exchange. We have some of hers. I don't know whether we got the whole set.
But I mean, also he writes to, although he doesn't, he says the duty of architects, of women is to be architects' wives. He does talk to her a lot in the letters about his clients, about the work he's doing, but often in quite detailed ways, as though he expects her to be interested in some of the details of what he's doing. So that it does imply...
I think that, after I was going to say the break, it wasn't exactly a break, but after things went very cold, she made it pretty clear she wasn't interested in architecture. And that was another great problem. And whether she was doing that to say, your boo sucks, or whether that was really the case. But I think he found that very frustrating because architecture was so important to him.
And she also found it frustrating, didn't she, that he became lionised latterly in life when they were getting, when there was a warmer relationship again. She still clearly found it incredibly irritating.
That's probably true in many relationships, I should think.
Well, doesn't she on one occasion say, I'm about to make myself the most popular wife in London by not attending a party?
I think it's possibly true. I think that, she was a bit glum. In fact, I think that might be the very word used by Harold Nicholson.
To describe her, really?
Yes, she was not a fount of joy. But the thing was that the great thing that had happened to her was that in 1910, by when Lutyens was a very, very established and successful domestic architect, she went on a holiday, I think, with her children to Varengeville in France, where Lutyens had built a house called Le Bois des Moutiers, which is the most wonderful house. He built it some years before. And it really, certainly under the owner's family, when I visited a couple of times, it retained this intense spirituality. It was very it was rather Art Nouveau in a sense. So Country Life didn't publish it. It wasn't one of the canon. But it was also very, very plain. And it did for some reason, radiate this rather attractive spirituality, calm. Anyway, Le Bois des Moutiers, and the family there were French Protestant bankers called Mallet, but they were also Theosophists.
Ah, yes.
And Theosophy was this crazy religion that was invented by a rather bogus woman at the end of the 19th century. There were a lot of these spiritual movements. As Christianity went somewhat into retreat, things took its place, and there was a lot of spiritualism and that kind of thing. Theosophy was a sort of pan-religion which took the best of other religions, I think, but had a particular kind of look to the East. And they were expecting there to be a second world teacher. The first world teacher had been Jesus Christ.
Yes.
So they were setting the bar quite high. But they thought this world teacher was going to come from the East. And so they set off to look for him. And lo and behold, they found him in the care, this radiant young boy, in the care of a rather, we would say now, sinister individual, I think, he was in the care of this individual who was I'm pretty sure he was a defrocked priest. Anyway, he was certainly a pervert. And so little boys were of particular interest, but he had this group of young Indian boys on the beach, and one called Krishnamurti was like a matinee idol of a slightly younger age, but he was very, very beautiful. And he was declared to be the world teacher, and he was brought back, and he was in the care of the Lutyenses for some time with his little brother who died. But, they were taken around, and when Reginald McKenna was Lord of the Admiralty...
This is another of Lutyens' patrons who we've talked about
in a previous podcast. They would be watching The Drooping of the Colour or something, and there'd be Lady Emily, Reginald McKenna, the first Sea Lord, whatever it was, and Krishnamurti, and some of the Lutyens children. The Lutyens children absolutely adored him. He was so beautiful and exotic and everything. But Lady Emily also adored him, and she really devoted her life to following him around wherever the Theosophists sent him.
And it's worth
around the world.
And it's worth saying, isn't it, that, he latterly denies that he's Krishnamurti himself denies that he's the teacher, doesn't he? And I mean,
Yes.
the whole thing falls apart. But the reach of Theosophy is very deep, isn't it? In the early 20th century.
Yes. I mean, all sorts of surprising people were
the Theosophists.
So it's taken quite seriously. And it had a source of money because one of the things they believed in was auras. And your spirit revealed itself through an aura, like a sort of halo, which not everybody could see. But there were different colours, depending on your
Financial commitment.
Well, you've got it in one, John. You've got it in one. I mean, your spiritual status,
bronze, silver, and gold.
You could work your way up through the auras, but strangely, this seemed to be related to how much you gave to the organisation. So you can see what it was like.
But sort of astonishing. And of course, this has a political twist for Lutyens as well, doesn't it? Because he is at the same time involved in building...
Yes, I should have said that Lady Emily's family, Lord Lytton, was not a conventional aristocrat. He was an opium taker, and he was a literary figure and a sort of boulevardier in Paris. But neither were her siblings, and one of them, certainly, and Lady Emily was attracted by this, was very, very heavily into the suffragette movement. Yes, to the extent, I mean, she insisted on getting arrested, and she was very cross whenever she was released because of her connections, which of course rather typically happened. So she dressed herself up as a working class girl to see what it was really like, and it was horrific. She was arrested for throwing stones at a minister's car or something, and put in prison and force-fed a number of times, which was a very, very horrific thing. She wrote about it. But she had a weak heart, and she had a heart attack, she had a stroke, and she became an invalid. So, I mean, this was very, they were very full on, kind of, in terms of the social issues of the day.
Do you know how many other siblings she had, or not? She doesn't have any brothers, does she?
Yes, she does, because she has Victor, who became the second Earl.
Of course.
So I don't know the exact number. I'm tempted to say a lot, but half a dozen, I guess. I'm not really quite sure.
But it's a family of strong personalities, in short, isn't it?
Strong and unexpected at this level of society.
And we should say, of course, that their home is Nebworth in Hertfordshire, where Lutyens does do work, doing a village nearby, a town plan.
Well, perhaps we should save this up, John.
We should save this up for part two and describe their clash over India. We will save this up for the next section of the podcast.
Don't go away.
Well, welcome back. And Clive is about to launch now into an answer to this question about Nebworth. And, I mean, it's a very peculiar house in a way to be associated with Lutyens, because from the outside today, when you go there, it looks like an extraordinary Gothic early 19th century fantasy.
A real romance, really. And,
Indeed.
Of course, it is a very strange house by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, John, it was... Thinking of you, it was... It was a Tudor house, wasn't it? Originally, a great, big, shocking Tudor house round a courtyard.
Indeed, it's an enormous building, and then it's transformed in the early 19th century and becomes this weird Gothic fantasy.
Did she knock the rest of it down? I mean, it is now basically one stretch of this quadrangle, isn't it?
Exactly, that still survives with all these various things, within. It's so typical of an English country house, isn't it? Of all these fragments locked inside it. It's a rather marvellous house, and
it's
it
wonderful.
Has fantastic 1840s interiors. Wonderful.
But the lady who came there in sort of the early 19th century, Mrs. Bulwer Lytton, coveted in statues and sort of gargoyles and crockets.
Yes, it is a gargoyle house, isn't it? When you go onto the roof, these extraordinary. They're not real stone, I seem to remember. They're a kind of false cement. Gargoyles.
So it's very Regency, really, in that respect.
It is, and
I think did the dreadful Bulwer Lytton, the literary person, did he ramp it up even further? I think he might have done.
Well, it's possible. I think much of it's a bit before him, but I'm slightly ashamed. I should know it instantaneously, but there is, in short, a fascinating story there.
But it was the age of the Eglinton tournament and craze, all these romantic, very early Victorian or Regency expressions of devotion towards the Middle Ages.
Exactly, and it's so contrary in a way to what we think of.
People dressing up in armour and having tournaments.
Yes, and you can't imagine. I don't think Lutyens ever did. You will correct me. A Gothic interior.
No.
Cannot, so, in other words, it is, in a sense, the very antithesis of everything that Lutyens was interested in.
No, that is absolutely true.
But you were saying that you don't think that Lady Emily is actually brought up there at all. I mean, it's rented out by the family, isn't it,
I
in
think
the late
that the
19th
father,
century?
the first Earl, dies in, I think, about 1890. She was... No, wait a minute. He was in Paris before that, and he really liked Paris. She was born in Paris. She was born in 1874. And so I don't think he was living at Nebworth very much. I don't know whether they went there or not. But I think, this wasn't a very rich family, as we said, by the standards of other aristocrats. And, well, this was quite typical of the aristocracy as a whole, because rents were very low because of the agricultural recession. They had to rent out. They couldn't afford to keep their places up. So I was very interested to see the other day when I went to Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island, which was a house built by J. Phipps, the son of a great steel man. Yes, who had been Andrew Carnegie. Do you remember he was the richest man in the world, sort of around about 1900, from steel. He'd been his partner. Well, that family, from photographs, I saw that they were renting Nebworth. It looked like every summer.
Goodness me, so from New York to Hertfordshire,
Well, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It had a big effect because living at Hitchin was a man called George Crawley, who was really a sort of antiquaire, a kind of antique dealer, really, not an architect. But Hitchin isn't very far from Nebworth. They somehow met George Crawley, and he then designed this rather marvellous house on Long Island called Old Westbury Gardens. Well, Westbury as it was at the time. It's now Old Westbury Gardens. And it was this... This is a slight diversion, but it was a time of Anglomania, and absolutely everybody who worked on that house came from England.
So there's...
White Alum, Devine, everybody.
What a bizarre...
Anyway, that was the connection from renting Nebworth.
I mean, it's a house, shall we say, with a strong taste and stuff.
Yes, indeed,
it's a muscular building. But Lutyens does interiors for it, but he also, when the Lyttons go back and occupy that, he does the design of a new town there.
Yes. I mean, I think I ought to say that, or we ought to say, warn the readers that, I mean, they might have assumed that because he'd married the daughter of an earl, this was good news for his career and that they would introduce lots of things to him. But they really didn't. But what he did do was these different projects at Nebworth. And it was when Lady Emily's brother, Victor, who became the second Earl, I think for a short time he was also a Viceroy of India, as it happens. But they then got the house back, obviously, evidently. And Lutyens was sort of doing almost odd jobs, bits and pieces for him.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Lady Emily doesn't... I mean, it's an important point to make, is that she doesn't seem to bring him many jobs.
No.
Gertrude Jekyll is the person, actually...
Oh, absolutely.
...through whom Lutyens gets lots of jobs through her network of friends.
Yes, totally.
So Lady Lytton, in a way, is a misleading figure, because you think... I mean, obviously, she brings him social status.
Yes. I mean, it was slightly bad luck, because a lot of other arts and crafts architects who weren't nearly as successful as Lutyens were disparaging of this chap who'd married an earl's daughter, and of course that was the reason he was getting on. Well, it wasn't at all, as it happens. It just looked like that.
It's fascinating, and he designs this planned town. Is that the first one?
Well, I should say before that, John. I mean, he fiddles around with Nebworth to quite an extent, because clearly Nebworth was almost a ludicrous building from his point of view, with all this overlay. I mean, it must have been so unfashionable.
Yes. In
the age when plain Neo-Georgian or Ren-derived styles were becoming the thing. People just didn't want this, all these, this over-furnishing.
Yes.
And everything being very cluttered and, including, not just inside, but outside. The skyline of Nebworth was highly cluttered with all these statues we've been talking about, all these heraldic beasts and things. So people didn't want that anymore. And Lutyens helped his brother Victor and Victor's beautiful wife, particularly, to kind of calm it all down.
Soften it a bit.
To calm it all down and take out some of these excesses and replace it with more simple panelling.
I mean, at risk of sounding, disloyal to the memory of Lutyens, I think that the drawing room, he creates this sort of neo-Jacobean, very restrained drawing room, doesn't he? A long gallery room on the ground floor. It's actually quite boring.
Yes, out went all the armour and all the banners
and all the
all the panoply. I mean, to our eye, I think that we would have quite liked the other. It would have been fun.
It would have been fun. But I was about to say the two things that I really remember from his additions to the house that I think are wonderful. The one is the nursery with that amazing light that he designs with the figures of angels on the light. And the light bulbs throw their shadow onto the ceiling. So there are presiding angels.
It must have been so
in
lovely.
the room.
You know, these rather glimmery light bulbs that they had in those days with these...
Yes, exactly. Playing with shadows are really... I mean, and the other thing is the head of that staircase, which is a sort of miniaturised... Do you remember you go up that back staircase and there's this very, very strange arrangement with edicules with bookcases in them. And it's like a sort of something between a doll's house and a full-scale house. And I thought that was, again, really ingeniously conceived and planned. Again, coming back to a point we've touched on before, that Lutyens' rooms are rather boring. What's so exciting about his architecture is how you move between them.
Well, yes, that's true. That's interesting. And in that case, I think that is very true. I mean, it is a slight... disappointment looking at Nebworth, looking for Lutyens' intervention in Nebworth. Of course, what he did also was to modify the garden, and I think that is successful. I think much simpler and kind of broader treatment, and a big hedge with white statues set against this hedge. And whereas before they would have been sort of dotted around the garden and not making very much effect. He did things which made it tell more.
It's interesting. And then he does this town plan, doesn't he?
Yes, that's right. Well, Nebworth is very near Letchworth. Yeah. And Letchworth Garden City was a big thing. This was, in fact, it was a huge thing, almost really for the world. Because Ebenezer Howard had this idea of the ideal settlement, which would be a place where people lived and worked, and it would bring the country into the town, and people could have an existence which was kind of
green,
yes, moderated by nature, if you like. I mean, it wasn't right in the sort of sticks of the countryside. I mean,
but well connected to London.
Yes, well connected to London. I mean, it was a very modern idea that it was going to be very green. Nature was going to be very tamed, but people were going to have access to nature, and sort of they could bicycle out into nature very easily. It was a rather wonderful conception, particularly at a time when towns were so filthy
and densely occupied.
Densely occupied. They were associated, even in my parents' day, as being... my parents couldn't imagine why I wanted to live in London. It seemed absolutely bonkers. But that's because the idea of the city as being a sort of sink of disease, and also so smoky. There's very, very unhealthy air. So Letchworth seemed to be... it was vastly influential throughout the world. These days, it's slightly not quite so flavour of the month because it was quite spread out. And so now that we're much more conscious of using land efficiently, it seems rather extravagant in its use of land. But it was a great idea, and a great English idea. But this happened round about 1900. And in 1904, very soon afterwards, Victor Lytton, who was looking for ways of boosting the income of the estate, thought he might have one at Nebworth. And I don't know that he did involve Ned originally, because Ned wrote this very funny letter saying, "Your new houses that you propose to build at Nebworth are ugly and vulgar. Do you mind this?"
Before taking on the job himself.
Well, I mean, his brother-in-law didn't really have any alternative after that, apart from to get Lutyens involved. He then became the sort of overseer of the project. It took a long time. I mean, I think that he didn't really have the money for it. He produced some very attractive promotional material for it. The picture on the front of which is this sort of Ralph Caldecott-ish illustration of two young people in rather kind of picturesque children's clothes, of a sort of rather nostalgic character on this big green. And there are some trees. And then poking above the trees is a single chimney. Which is the entire extent that you can see of this model village. I think to call it a town is too much. It was always going to be Nebworth Garden Village. Letchworth had been Letchworth Garden City, but this was, had more modest aspirations to be a village. And it was going to be built around the railway station that had come about 20 years before.
And it was only partially... I mean, you can see little bits of it today, but it was only partially ever realised, wasn't it?
Well, it's a sad thing because... Yes, it was only partially realised. There were sort of glimmers, because Lutyens designed a wonderful, wonderful church. It was on a Greek cross within a square. It was an ingenious plan, and he designed a golf club which is very charming. And so he designed these flashes, and there are a few houses that he designed. It got rather... I don't think there was ever the capital really to build it out, and then the First World War came and slightly ran out of steam.
It is interesting. I mean, it isn't directly related to this at all, but of course Lady Emily does comment, doesn't she, when Lutyens gets the commission to build Liverpool Catholic Cathedral, the greatest cathedral never built, that she commented rather dryly that it would have been much better if he'd received a commission to build some social housing instead. Clearly it is a concern of hers also, housing.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose it has to be said that was quite a sharp observation, because Liverpool was full of these Catholic families, or Irish Catholic, who were really poor. And so to build this gigantic, it was going to be just a tiny bit, for tactful reasons, smaller than St. Peter's in Rome. So it was going to be about, at least twice the size of St. Paul's, I think. It's going to be huge.
It is
and so, to build that for this flock of very poor people who were expected to contribute to it, of course for the glory of God, but,
yes.
That was a sort of fair observation.
You think?
Well, no, of course, I'm torn, because even what was built, the crypt, is stunning and astounding. But the other thing that's very interesting about Nebworth Garden Village is that it leads directly, or almost directly. Anyway, it was practically the only piece of town planning he had done before he got the job to design New Delhi. So it leaps from this garden village. He did also design, and this was, quite an important step, because Lord Crewe, who was something like chairman of Hampstead Garden Suburb, I think Limited possibly, he was actually also the colonial secretary. So anyway, Lutyens got the job of designing the centrepiece of Hampstead Garden Suburb. It's called Central Square. It's not the whole of Hampstead Garden Suburb, and the rest of Hampstead Garden Suburb is sort of quite different. It's much more villagey by the people who had designed Letchworth. But Lutyens got the job of designing the Central Square, which he did in this, with 3 great public buildings on it, 2 churches and an institute, but in a sort of French classical layout, rather like Place des Vosges or something like that, on a big scale. And those were the only 2 examples of town planning he'd done before he was asked to do the imperial capital of the Raj.
And this is another really interesting point where Lady Emily's career intersects with creative friction, shall we say, with Lutyens's, because, of course, by this stage, by the time he begins to build New Delhi, she is beginning to be really interested in supporting Indian independence.
Yes.
And this is, needless to say, an embarrassment to Lutyens, who is trying to square up everybody in the colonial office to build the capital of capitals.
Yes.
Which celebrates, the eternity of British power. Of course, we all know now it's completed pretty much as the empire. The jewel in the crown falls from the crown, and India becomes independent. And this extraordinary tension that she's in London entertaining members, Indians who were agitating for independence, while Lutyens is
in her own drawing room.
While Lutyens is trying to design this great imperial city that celebrates the eternity of British power in the subcontinent. It's weird.
I think when they started, to be fair, it wasn't quite so obvious it was going to finish.
He might not have got the job.
No, but it wasn't quite so obvious. You said that it didn't have very long to run, but of course it started just before the First World War.
1911.
And if there had been no First World War, then maybe it wouldn't have seemed so stupid. But of course it does. By the time it was actually finished, which wasn't until about 1930, Indian independence came very soon after that, just after the Second World War. So it does seem an odd thing. Of course, Lutyens went to India with a lot of preconceptions about Indian architecture, which we might now say were blinkered.
Well, they're bizarre. He claims that the only work of architecture in India is a small and rather wonderful place called Datia. It's a completely bizarre reaction to such a wealth and interest of architecture that he almost dismisses it out of hand. It's extraordinary.
Yes. It's interesting that actually the administration was much more embracing of Indian architecture than Lutyens was. The administration. There had been in India this style, Hindu Saracenic, which was a sort of blending of Indian architecture with essentially the Gothic revival, which was popular in Bombay and elsewhere.
It's sort of Mughal with Hindu details blended into it, and
that great station, and the VT, was
and this wonderful engineer,
Victoria Terminal.
This engineer, who's Swinton Jacobs, isn't
it?
Who's, I mean, it's really curious that so many Indian buildings in the 19th century are built by Royal Engineers because they're out there. And they're an extraordinary group of people in many ways, but they're totally looked through because they're not architects. And yet
that's true.
They're often building things on a scale that, many architects in Britain would have envied at the time. I mean, it's amazing.
Yes, and very useful buildings, and indeed have been generally, there's great affection for some of them.
Yes, indeed.
But it's rather like Baker, Lutyens' colleague, who joined him, who was slightly older and rather in awe of Lutyens. Really, they'd known each other in the offices of Ernest George, which Lutyens went through in quite a short time, and Baker stayed there for 8 years. But anyway, Baker went out to, it seems incredible, he went out to South Africa to try to sort out his brother, who had a fruit farm there. And his family, he'd been an architect, but he didn't go to be an architect. He went
to be a fruit farmer.
Well, with this family mission, because his dad had invested his money in this fruit farm, and it was all getting rather pear-shaped. Fruit metaphor.
We're moving away from Lady Emily.
May I just say, not to be daunted by that interruption, John.
Point of order.
Yes. Well, Baker had this huge career in South Africa, huge. And, he was actually building the Pretoria. But, apart from anything else, but he built 300 houses and blah, blah, blah. But they didn't have the kudos because they were colonial. And I think it was the same in India.
That they didn't have the kudos.
In London. Yes. When they were choosing somebody to do these imperial commissions, they didn't really think of Baker because he was, over there somewhere.
They wanted, someone from London to go out and do it. And
because that'd be better, you get the top man. But the top man would be in London. Well, it was extraordinary that Baker was far, far more
experienced,
qualified, and there were other architects who were more experienced than Lutyens. And I have to say that probably Lutyens was very good at pulling the levers.
Even though he wasn't a committee man, he was good at...
No, he wasn't. No, what he was very good at was chatting up rich people. And he was exceptionally good at that. The civil servants who were responsible for New Delhi said, for goodness sake, Lutyens, he designs all these houses for rich people. He's got a terrible reputation for extravagance. And, to a certain extent, they were right. But Lutyens still could get the job because he knew all these people. He wasn't then so good at actually kind of manoeuvring with the committees because he just completely misjudged it.
Yes, and extra, he didn't realise that committees might just say no when he said that something had gone over budget.
Yes, that's right. And no meant no. In this case, a rich man could reach for his checkbook with sufficient, if you'd been oiled up sufficiently.
Yes, but no number of doodles and charming letters would persuade a committee that they ought to find another £10,000 or something.
No, exactly.
Their sleeves, yes.
Exactly.
With Lady Emily, I mean, it's an embarrassment to him, isn't it, personally, that she begins to entertain and agitate actively for Indian independence. But is that really going on in the 30s, or does it start really much earlier than that? Do you know when she becomes swept up into this cause?
I think it's probably part and parcel of Theosophy. I think it was,
Yes, through Krishnamurti and everything.
Yes, I think things like female suffrage and, independence, I think they were, they tended to go together.
And it comes back to this point that she's a woman with enormous, drive and determination, like her suffragette sister. She takes on causes, and then she pursues them.
It's progressive.
With absolute determination, single-mindedness.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, although it seems, conceivably slightly potty, role in Theosophy, it was certainly pursued very single-mindedly, with a sort of tremendous zeal. It was like a sort of 19th century missionary.
And this also, at some point, this does cause a breakdown in their relationship, doesn't it? I mean, we come now to Lady Sackville.
Oh, yes.
That's
I think we should just say that, Lutyens did, in fact, in the end, he went to India with these preconceptions, and he thought it was rather stupid. And what he particularly disliked was the chaos, as he saw, particularly in Hindu architecture. He found going to a Hindu temple, he never reconciled himself with that, to be honest. He found that it was chaotic. What he wanted was to, and in a sense, this was the ideal of the young people who believed in the Raj. Of course, these days, people have a poor view of empire, so it's all slightly coloured. But there were idealistic people who thought that the order that Britain brought to its colonial possessions, Pax Britannica, and the
civilising
order, the
power,
civilization, the railways, and the fact it's all going to work smoothly together without there being intestinal rivalries. I mean that, but
intestinal. I think it might be rather unfortunate to have intestinal. It's very uncomfortable. But
very uncomfortable. But
internecine, I believe.
Possibly appropriate to India, I should think, but of that day. But
no, but it's true that it's a sort of totally different vision, and New Delhi is trying to express a vision of empire.
Because Lutyens looked on it, he said that because it was ultimately went back to Wren, his idea of Wren, although it doesn't look very much like Wren, but it went back to Wren, and he said that the age of Wren was the age of Newton. I.e. this view that the universe operated like a clock. Yeah. The age of Wren was the age of Newton, and you couldn't have one without the other. I mean, that Newton's universe wouldn't have been possible without... I mean, this went across the whole of the age, and that's what Lutyens liked and believed in. Although, in the end, his New Delhi was, or his Viceroy's house, Rashtrapati Bhavan, was a synthesis.
Yes, indeed.
And he introduced quite a lot of Indian motifs into it.
There's from the stupa at Sanchi, around the base of the dome, there's this sort of a fence of stone that he lifts, and the dome itself is a very curious shape, isn't it?
It's sort of blancmange-shaped.
And it's low. And all these Indian forms that he incorporates, he deep drip stones. And
yes, that's right. There's very... very, very deep eaves, for the shade. And fountains at the top. There were sort of bowls.
Exactly, where the water cascades over.
To show the abundance.
And it is peculiar, isn't it? But by the time it's been completed, everyone can see that it's an extraordinary act of hubris to have commissioned this. There's a French observer, isn't it, who, I can't remember who it is, but it's meant to have overlooked it and said this will be the greatest ruin of them all.
Well, of course it's not, because it has been very well cared for.
It has been very well cared for. But I suppose his point is fair, isn't it? Not that it's a physical ruin, but that it isn't actually... It didn't express the imperial dominion. Ultimately, it came to express the independence of India. His
nose was put out of joint because it's slightly bigger than Versailles.
So come on, let's hear. Back to Lady Emily, and this. I mean, there is this period where they really do have a very cold patch, don't they? And and this whole debate over Indian independence intersects with that, doesn't it? And he becomes very close to another person who is a patron of his, Lady Sackville.
Yes, it's really extraordinary. I mean, throughout Lutyens' life, and there were several figures in his early life who were also extraordinarily colourful older women. Well, I'm not sure whether Lady Sackville was older, but she was certainly very colourful. She was the chatelaine of Noel. She was the daughter of a half-gypsy dancer from Madrid. And this half-gypsy dancer, called Pepita, had married an attaché from the embassy, Lord Sackville. And they had had a daughter who's Victoria, who subsequently became Lady Sackville herself. I think this shows some determination by marrying her cousin. So her father had been Lord Sackville, but then she married her cousin to retain the title of Lady Sackville and to be the chatelaine of Noel. And they lived pretty independent lives. And Noel, of course, is this wonderful, wonderful house, huge.
Rambling.
Great big rambling, but full of treasures, of silver furniture. And I mean, the most magical things. And,
in wonderful parkland and,
with these very ancient trees. I mean, it's just a wonder. But she was in charge of it, and she had when she met Lutyens, lots and lots of money, and they had this extraordinary relationship between these two sort of not quite elderly, but sort of late middle-aged people, and quite sort of rather embarrassing, really. They called each other. Lutyens had called his friends. There was a time when all the young people were marrying Scottish people like McKenna, and so he talked about McReg because he's Reginald McKenna, and McPam as being Mrs. McKenna, and various others in that circle. And so he started calling Lady Sackville McSack, and he was McNed for Edwin Ned Lutyens. So MacSack and MacNed had this relationship, which is sort of, one of those rather embarrassing things to look into from the outside. It's rather like Ruskin's embarrassing relations with his young girlfriends that he had, where they talked in sort of baby language. It was a bit slightly like that. Anyway, they had this time when Lutyens's home life with Lady Emily was bleak. She could provide this wonderful world of, a bit of admiration, but a great deal of comfort, I think, as well. And comfort of all kinds.
And company and entertainment.
Yes.
And they write a long correspondence which is entirely destroyed. She destroys it, doesn't she? That's right. The correspondence does not survive.
No, that would have been interesting.
Yes, you wonder how we know that they call each other MacNed and MacSack.
Oh, well, because I think that it's in Lutyens's letters, and I think it's pretty well known. I mean,
he creates something for her, doesn't he? Does he build a house on the south coast?
Yes, he does, and actually, it's one of the few things which is a complete disaster. It goes wildly over budget. I think probably, she was a capricious person who kept on changing her mind, probably, which is not a very good thing, and he was being rather indulged, and so all got totally out of hand, and actually it really produced nothing of architectural interest whatsoever, which is rather strange. I mean, he had this slightly disastrous home life in that he could never have his house was never the setting for for the life that somebody like him might have aspired to. From in a literary, he would have probably liked a literary artistic circle with his painter friends and so on, coming to dinner and lots of fun and chat, in this rather wonderful rooms with these extraordinary colours that he'd created, these lacquered colours and black ceilings and things. Well, that never happened. But then when he really had the opportunity to create something which could have been a marvellous domestic setting, it just was a disaster.
For this changeable client.
A disaster at many levels, because then it was all very well when she had all this money and she could give Lutyens a Rolls Royce with a driver called James. So he could say, "Home, James!" which she never really wanted. But she didn't always have the money. The money ran out. And then she became rather odd and became convinced that Lutyens had basically been taking things, she had given him things, and she became convinced that he'd taken these things, which wasn't the case at all. But she became so fixated about it that he had to take her to court to stop her making all these charges, and she lost.
Close friendship that ends very unhappily.
Yeah, and so it ended in disaster, yes.
Can I ask, while you're talking about it, it suddenly occurred to me, what are Lutyens' relationships with his own children? We know that he's terribly, terribly good. We've talked about before how good he is with other people's children. Yes. But what is his relationship with his own children and their relationship with their mother?
Yes, it's really interesting. He had one son called Robert, who became an architect, but of course that was a terribly difficult and unwise course to follow, really, because, his dad, Lutyens, was this dominant figure. And Robert was never quite up to snuff, and he was always, in the soup, as they said, when he was at school, I think possibly Eton. Of course, they wanted to send Krishnamurti to Eton, because if he was going to be the world ruler, the world teacher.
He ought to go have a good English public school education.
And of course, obviously, he'd have to go to Eton. But, he didn't go to Eton in the end, but I think Robert did. But, Robert had a sort of disappointing career, so he had a mixed attitude to his father because of that. But strangely, Lady Emily, these days, the children would probably have been taken away by social services because she was fixated on Krishnamurti and Theosophy. And this was a worldwide movement, and she was always going off to places like Australia.
And she'd just take them with her.
She'd take the children with her, and then, the call would come to go to India, and she'd just leave them, and they had to find their own way home. So, you wouldn't have thought, you might have thought that they would have grown up feeling rather neglected. But extraordinarily enough, they adored their mother.
And not their father so
much.
And
not their father. I think there might have been a degree that, she was the one who was the Earl's daughter. And their father was this figure who told all these jokes. You can imagine, totally embarrassing. Have your father telling, these silly babyish jokes, which some people thought were very funny, but they thought, oh, Dad, come on, And he was also working all the time. So it really is extraordinary, because Lutyens was himself always a child, in a sense. And he identified, he could speak to children and, amuse them with all these doodles that he did. But I believe that he only saw his own children on Sundays.
Yeah, it is completely
So it was a strange
isn't it? It's a very, very
thing,
bizarre.
difficult to fathom.
And, I mean, to draw this to a close, Lady Emily outlives Lutyens.
Yes.
And do we know much about what happened? I mean, after he dies...
Yes, he died in 1944, 1st of January 1944. And then I think that Lady Emily sort of curates his reputation. And I think, she must have worked with Christopher Hussey on his great biography, which was published, I think, about 1950 or something like that. And these amazing memorial volumes, because I think there's been no architect who was so well commemorated after his death as Lutyens, because Country Life, which was a magazine but also had a very large book imprint, undertook the publication of these large, these 3 enormous
volumes.
Books of all his works, or his principal works, and this major biography of about 500 pages, beautifully written by Christopher Hussey.
It is an extraordinarily good biography, isn't it?
It's a piece of prose. I think it's just really enormous.
It reads really beautifully, and it does help your posthumous reputation to have everything published and published beautifully and incisively in that way.
That's true. And all written, of course, from an entirely pro-Lutyens
point of view, with no but interestingly edited. No, well, what a fascinating story. Well, Clive, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Thank you too to our editor Rebecca Lilly, who, from a standing start, has mastered the software to edit this podcast and has done a great job. Our next podcast will be released on Thursday, and our focus will be one of the most famous buildings in Britain, built by William the Conqueror within the Roman Wall of London, and witness to some of the most epic scenes of English history, as well as some of the most brutal. I am referring, of course, to the Tower of London. See you next week.